Welcome back, everyone. We do have quite a few questions to get through here, so I'm just going to dive right in. The first few questions are around grain markets. So Cal, these will be coming your way. Several times you mentioned the emotions connected with the volatility of the markets. What did you mean by using that term?
So a lot of emotions in the markets, and you can imagine if we have a limit up day one day and a limit down day the others, people's emotions really get torn apart. There's some nice graphs out there that show as a rally occurs, people go from hope and greed to fear and despair. And a lot of times people will make decisions that aren't very disciplined, and they'll go with their emotions. If it was a terrible day yesterday in the markets, they feel like they need to sell everything, or vice versa. And we like to have objectives out there that are disciplined, that we come up with when there aren't emotions involved, and to make those objectives and those sales made when they hit, and not because of emotions, because emotions can kind of have a big impact on the way people market. And there's a reason that a lot of people have marketing advisors help them out doing the marketing so they can take that emotions out. I even have a number of farm operators that I work with that they'll have their spouses do the marketing with them, because they've watched this little seed of corn grow up all the season long, and it's hard for them to make a sale of it, and they turn that over to somebody else. So there is a lot of emotions in grain marketing.
Great, thanks, Cal. Does any of the Brazil corn production go to the ethanol production?
So good question regarding ethanol production in Brazil. Majority of that comes from sugarcane. There is a small percentage of it that comes from corn. If the sugar price gets to be very high and it's more profitable for Brazil to sell it as sugar, they'll do that and use more corn for ethanol, but most of their ethanol comes from sugarcane in Brazil.
Great. How are the grain marketing committee recommendations implemented?
The grain marketing committee recommendations. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a committee of 8 people that meet every 2 weeks. We'll put a memo together with all of our objectives on it for the old year crop and the new year crops. And every manager will have that in front of them. Also, when those objectives hit, we will send out an email alerting them that that objective is hit. So we know that every manager works with different clients with different objectives, and some want to be a little more aggressive and some a little more conservative, but at least our managers have a framework to work from when they're making their grain sales.
Thanks, Cal. Do Brazilian soybeans bring a higher price than U.S. soybeans on the world market?
So world market price of soybeans, so that's going to vary a lot during the season, and it varies a lot with freight costs. I did just read some things over the weekend where U.S. soybeans are now cheaper than Brazil soybeans, so it does vary during the season, and it makes a big difference when their crop is harvested and when they have a big glut of that to sell a little bit cheaper price, and they'll undercut us shortly after their harvest. But shortly after our harvest, typically that switches around, and things have just switched at this point where our price of soybeans on the world market is cheaper than Brazil's.
Do you have any speculation on where the 37% of the soybeans are sold?
So there was a slide with advanced sales of soybeans, and I think 40% of them were going to China, and about 37% was undetermined. It seems like most years the majority of that ends up going to China, but we never really know for sure. So I would say at least probably half of those will end up to China, but that's why they're undisclosed. We don't know for sure, but seems like a lot of years it goes that direction.
Okay, thanks, Cal. This person wants to know, why has there been no mention of Ukraine as a corn competitor?
Ukraine is a good competitor. We only have so many slides every year, so there's been a number of years where we've had slides looking at Ukraine and their corn production. They probably produce maybe 10% of the corn that the U.S. does, but a lot of their corn does get exported, so it is a competitor for us. I think they export maybe about 1/3 of the bushels that we do. When the trade war was going on with China, China was going their direction for some corn, so they are a competitor. Typically, we've always thought as Ukraine as more producing wheat, but they are doing better with corn all the time. Last year they did great. This year they've had some weather problems, and their production and exports are going to fall off some.
Great, thanks, Cal. You cited USDA projections of crop prices. Is that projected cash price in October of this year, or what market and date is it a projection of?
So USDA prices, they are projecting a average price for the year, and that's also weighted. So if a lot of farmers maybe sell more in the fall, when prices are a little bit lower, things get weighted a little bit low to the lower side, and then they keep using that weighted average and project the sales as it goes through the year. So that is a average cash price, typically figured in central Illinois. And that's where they come up with it at, and it's an average weighted price for the year.
Thanks, Cal. This question might be a question for you or Jeff. What effect will climate change have on markets?
So the effect on effect of markets on climate change. So climate change does create there is some erratic weather out there that we know about. It does create some opportunities in grain marketing. When there's more volatility, there's more opportunities, of course, to make some great sales when you're ready for those opportunities. So in the marketing, we kind of like the volatility because it does give us opportunities to hopefully do a better job and end up in that top third of the market for our clients.
Thanks, Cal. Looks like we got one more question around grain markets, and then we'll move into some leases questions. Are there any charts to plot relative levels of option prices on grain future contracts? Are the levels now high, low, or average?
So there are charts out there for options, and we do study that, as we have had years where if this market would have continued to been very strong and we would have got to the level where we weren't comfortable forward contracting more crop, we would have looked at options and looked at that as a scenario price insurance to lock in a really nice floor on the market at a fixed known cost of the premium, but it still left the top end open for us. And so there are charts that we can study that, and we did have a plan in place if the market would have continued to rally, that we would have looked at some option strategies on the farms that we manage.
I think in general, though, to answer that question a little further, anytime you see a lot of volatility in the market, you're going to see higher premiums for those options because it's all based on how much people are betting how much the market's going to move, and the more erratic the movement of the market, the more expensive the options become.
Thank you both. Looks like we're going to move into some leases questions now. On Friday, the presenter mentioned that step up in estates may be modified. Where may I get more information on this proposal?
I think there's a lot of information out there on different websites on that. You could also send me an email, and I can get you to some blog sites and some information about that. The concern that I have right now is that a lot of people are getting pretty excited about that, but it's a long ways from a new law. And so I'd be a little careful making any urgent decisions about that, because I'm not sure that that's all going to come to bear, especially in the format that they're laying it out today. I think there are also some exceptions to that for family farms that are being handed down to heirs. So there's lots of things to think about there. But again, if you want to just send me an email, I'll get you some sites that you could look at that have some factual information.
Thanks, Jeff. For lease terminations, we put the language in our lease for the year, and the operator signs that separately on the lease document. Is that good enough?
You want to repeat that for me?
Sure.
Yeah.
For lease terminations, we put the language in our lease for the year, and the operator signs that separately on the lease document. Is that good enough?
Yeah, there in Iowa, this is different in different states, but in Iowa, there is no such thing as a self-terminating lease. So that you can sign your termination at the same time that you sign your lease, but they do need to be two separate documents. So if you want to do it that way, that's great, but make it a totally separate document. Don't incorporate it into your lease. In Nebraska, for example, you can actually state that the lease is for a certain term, and once you get to the end of that term, that lease is terminated. But here in Iowa, you need to do it separately.
Thanks, Jeff. Does a flex rent qualify for QBI?
That's a great question, and it has lots of different answers depending on who you're talking to. If you are putting in 250 hours of management time on your farm, you should qualify for the qualified business income deduction, even though you may not meet some of the other criteria. Now, 250 hours doesn't sound like that much until you start breaking it down. That's 5 hours a week, and you can't count the time that you spend going back and forth to your farm. You can't count the time that you spend just looking over your financial documents for the farm. You actually have to be out doing some management on the farm, working with your tenant on what kind of rotation you're going to have, or maybe what kind of improvements you're going to make, those kinds of things. So yes, there is a way to qualify. but it's probably not as easy as it first sounds. But 250 hours is kind of that trigger. And the IRS also requires that that be documented as you go. You can't just sit down on December 15th and start remembering how many times you were out at the farm and what you did. You have to actually document that as you go.
What is the fee for Hertz to assess land value and cash rent for lands in Northwest Iowa?
The fee depends on what kind of lease you're on. Our management services are kind of a full management service. We don't do a lot of a la carte, just determining what rents are for people. So while we have some consulting that we do, telling somebody what they should cash rent their farm for is not one of them, just because it's hard for us to get enough information to do that well at a reasonable price. And we don't want to be held out as, well, Hertz said that the rent should be X. That doesn't work well for anybody. We want to be able to explain why we arrived at the rent we arrived at. So doing it on an a la carte basis is not something that we get involved in. If you want to call in, we can discuss it. We can talk about some resources that you can use to determine where your rent should be. But setting a rent for you is not something that we're going to do.
The other part of that was the broker price opinions, and we do those on a regular basis. And typically those can be done fairly quickly and very reasonably priced. Gives you a great idea of the value of the farm. If it's a situation where you may end up in court or have some problems with that, you need a certified appraisal. But if you're just looking at a good, strong land value that you can hang your hat on for the farm, a broker's price opinion would work really well for the land value part of that question.
Great. What are the 4 dates you would use to calculate crop prices for a flex lease?
Yeah, I mentioned the four dates, and typically we're using something that around the first of each quarter. A lot of times, though, the fall one will end up being December 1st instead of January 1st, just because we want to determine what that flex lease is going to be before the end of the year. So something around the beginning or end of March, beginning or end of June, beginning or end of September, and then December are the typical dates. There's nothing magic about that. What it does do for your tenant is that if he doesn't want to have any risk, if he sells a quarter of his crop at each of those timetables, at least the portion of the crop that would be used to pay the rent, so roughly 30 to 40%, he has no risk because he already received that price on those bushels that he's going to pay the rent with. So that's one of the reasons that we set some dates, just to come up with the average, but also to give the operator enough information that he can kind of mitigate his risk.
Thanks, Jeff. You mentioned rent increases. Is that 5 to 15% or $5 to $15 per acre?
I was talking in percentages because every lease type is every lease is a little different in terms of what level they're at now. So, a $5 increase on a $200 rent is a lot bigger increase than a $5 increase on a $400 rent. So I was talking in terms of percentages. And again, if you look at where the average prices were last year versus this year, even after you factor in government payments, we think they're going to be up by that, at least 5%.
Thanks, Jeff. What are the different ways to determine average prices for the year and figuring bonus rent on top of cash rent?
One of the ways, of course, is just to use that, picking those 4 dates throughout the year. You can use the USDA average. You can use the crop insurance numbers. Those are posted. So they're anything that is available to both owner and the operator on a fairly easy basis is a good way to go. If you have a local elevator that both you and your operator are familiar with, just taking their posted price on a particular day would be a great way to do it.
Thanks, Jeff. Cal, it looks like I got another grain markets question for you. What factors cause the yield lines of both corn and soybeans to continue to rise up?
So another great question. So what factors help the yields continue to go up? A lot of it is genetics. We've had great technology with genetics going forward. There's been a lot of things with both disease prevention, Also, we've got genetics that are much more drought resistant than what we've had in the past. And those will really be tested this year with the drought that we have in the northwestern part of the Corn Belt. But genetics is a huge part of that. So we've got great equipment too. The farmers have. There's even farmers that can do a great job planting at 10 mile per hour now, where that was unheard of when I first started my career. So you've got great equipment, great operators, great genetics out there all working together that's helping these trend line yields to improve.
Thanks, Cal. What is the source for rents in Illinois that you mentioned that hasn't come out yet?
Yeah, typically in Illinois, the Illinois Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers puts out a booklet sometime here in August, and or at least the information comes out. A lot of times the book is a little delayed from that, but that's typically the source that we use. That source is often quoted on FarmDoc there for the University of Illinois. So that's another source.
Great. What are removal rates per bushel for corn and soybeans for P&K for Iowa and Illinois?
Removal rates for P&K are dependent on the crop. So it's a little different for corn than it is for beans, and it depends on your yield. So you have to factor in both of those things. But in general, in a large portion of Iowa and Illinois, if you're raising a 200 bushel corn crop, you're going to remove somewhere in the neighborhood of, give or take, 50 pounds of phosphorus, and you're going to remove 70 to 80 pounds of potash. On soybeans, if you have a typical 60 bushel yield, you're going to be kind of almost the opposite. You're going to be a little higher on potash, and I said that backwards on the corn. I apologize. Those numbers should have been flipped. 70 to 80 pounds on the phosphorus, 50 pounds on the potash, and then on beans it would be closer to 50 pounds on the phosphorus and 70 to 80 pounds on the potash.
Thanks, Jeff. What government payments are not expected this year?
Well, government payments are not expected this year. Any of the payments that would be tied to revenue. So we've had some in the past, the ARC payments and the PLC payments are typically tied to price and yield, and it doesn't look like either one of those will be triggered this year. We've also had some kind of interim payments that were made based on the export issues that we were having with China, and this year we're not having any of those issues, so we don't expect any of those. There was also some payments tied to COVID that we're not expecting this year.
Thanks, Jeff. What are the negatives to using manure?
The negatives to working with manure would typically be timing of application. Typically you have a window of opportunity to get manure applied to a farm, and if it happens to be wet right then, but you still have to get it applied, you can get some compaction issues. Also, if you're not careful with rates, you can have too much manure on in a particular area, and that can burn the crop roots. And so those are a couple of the main ones. Certainly, many more advantages to the use of manure, and we recommend it wherever an owner is comfortable using it, because it's a great source not only of nutrients but also organic matter to help build the organic matter of the farm.
Thank you.
Another downside might be the odor of it. So especially those that are from the city that aren't used to smelling the manure, they would look at that as a downside. So
Thank you, Jeff and Cal. If I custom farm, do I file a Schedule F at tax time?
When it comes to your tax forms, you probably need to work with your tax preparer and make sure that they're using a form that they're comfortable with. In general, I would say that most people that are on a custom use a Schedule F, but there are some custom operations that file a 4835, and depending on your situation, that may be perfectly fine. But depending on which form you use, you may or may not be able to use a Section 179 deduction for that.
Thanks, Jeff. Lease rate discussion has been based only on crops and government payments. What kind of consideration should be given to other revenue sources? For example, wind turbines, pipelines, easements, and carbon credits.
Now, when it comes to leases, at least, carbon credits might be one that would factor in if your operator is collecting those, so that may affect your lease terms. But when it comes to wind turbines and pipelines, typically those would be a negative for the farm operator because they're probably not participating in receiving any of the income, but they're having to farm around or through the area that a pipeline ran through, for example, that may not be quite as productive. So I think on those kinds of things, you have to maybe if a certain farm would rent for X number of dollars without the wind turbines or without the pipeline running through it, you're probably going to be just slightly lower than that just to offset the either lack of yield from the disturbance of the soil or the having to jockey around a wind turbine out there in the field. But you know, I think most people take that into account when they're talking with their tenant, because their tenant is going to make them aware of that, and that will be a factor that probably reduces rents, not increases rents.
Thanks, Jeff. Does Hertz take the initiative to cancel a contract, or are they waiting on us cash renters to tell them to cancel the contract?
You know, certainly it depends on the year who's going to cancel the contract. You know, if it's a year that looks like rents might be a little softer, landlords are typically not quick to go ahead and cancel the lease because they're probably happy with the rent that they received the year before. In a year like this, we're certainly going to be proactive about terminating those lease agreements now. At Hertz, because we want to treat operators fairly, we talk about it every year. And for example, last year I called a number of operators and just said, hey, I just wanted you to know the owner's happy with the rent that we had a year ago. We're probably not going to cancel the lease this year. If you think things should change, you should let us know. So that's typically how we would handle it.
For your clients with cash rent leases, do you help their tenants with the marketing?
For cash rent leases, if an operator wants to know what we're doing on the marketing side, we're certainly willing to share that with them. And if they ask specifically for some help in that area, certainly we're happy to give them some advice. There are certainly a lot of pure marketing services out there that are available as well. But it's not uncommon for our operators to ask us when we're out, what are you doing on the grain marketing side? And we'll be willing to share that with them.
When looking at cash rent calculations, which factors do you take most into consideration? CSR ratings, a % of land value, or corn and soybean prices?
Well, that's a great question, and Cal might help me out on that, but I would say they're all important. Certainly it doesn't, you know, if grain prices are high, it doesn't matter what CSR you're on, you're probably going to see an increase in rents. And by the same token, no matter how low prices get, a high CSR farm is going to rent for more than a low CSR farm. So, you know, in certain ways, all those factors are important, but depending on the year, one might have a greater importance than another.
With the new laws regarding step up, is it an advantage to custom farm?
You know, as I indicated in my presentation, for most of the things associated with the state tax, there's an advantage to having a share of the crop because it makes you eligible for more things. The special use valuation, step up in basis isn't tied to a particular lease type, but it does allow you to have some other flexibility in other areas. If you want to pay your estate tax over time, you have to be on some kind of a share lease or a custom lease. So I would say it's, you know, there's advantages to being on a lease where you're getting a share of the crop, but not necessarily just for the step up basis. That would not be a reason in and of itself.
Thanks, Jeff. UCC1 was mentioned. Is there a deadline to file?
Yeah, the deadline for filing a UCC1 the first time is within 20 days of when the lease is signed. If you wait longer than that, then there's a chance that a banker or somebody else would be in first position. And even though you would still have the landlord's lien perfected, it might be behind another security for a bank or another lender. So 20 days within that first lease. Then, at least here in Iowa, that UCC1 continues. And even though you may sign a new lease the next year, you already have your UCC1 in place, so you would still be in first position. Historically, that after 5 years, you need to renew that UCC1. But if you're making major changes to your lease, you might want to terminate the old one and put a new one in place if you're concerned about that.
Recovering CAPEX expenses can be an issue for landowners. What suggestions do you have for on-farm grain storage, tiling, and terraces?
I guess you read the first part of that question again.
Sure. Recovering CAPEX expenses can be an issue for landowners.
Okay, so when it comes to trying to finance the improvements, a lot of times that you can use a local lender or Farm Credit Services, for example. There's some great resources there to be able to do that. FSA, or the Farm Service Agency, also has a loan program for some of those improvements that you can get. If you're doing something in the way of waterways and terraces, there are some cost share programs with FSA and NRCS that you can take advantage of. So there's lots of different sources out there and resources out there. So I think any of those are a possibility. Another possibility is just having an agreement with your operator that maybe he's interested in putting those improvements on your farm, and then you depreciate him over time. And if he ever leaves the farm, then he gets reimbursed for some percentage of that. Not the first route I would recommend, but it's certainly better than asking your operator to continue to farm a farm that needs improvements.
And also just planning ahead is huge too. So if we know that the farm might need a grain bin down the road, we might start planning for that a couple, 3 years in a row and setting some money aside. So when that year does come up, we've got money ready for it. We've talked about it with the clients, with the farm operators. Everybody's kind of on board, ready for that improvement. And that's a nice way to just plan ahead and make that happen once it occurs down the road.
Thank you. How do landowners have access to crop insurance info in cash rent situations?
I think as we talked about setting expectations, I think that's a critical part of your initial conversations with your operator is what kind of information you expect them to provide. And then if you ask for it up front, you need to make sure and follow through and request it later. Because if you put it in your lease that, hey, you need to provide me your APH records or your yield records at the end of each season, and then you don't ask for them, after 2 or 3 years of you not asking for them, that expectation has kind of gone away. Even though it may be in the lease, if you didn't enforce it, it's kind of being ignored by both parties at that point. So again, setting those expectations up front as to what you're expecting will set everybody up for success because everybody knows exactly what's expected of them. And then just the follow through of simply asking for that information. If they don't provide it and it's in the lease, then you certainly have a reason to move on to a different operator if that becomes a problem.
Thanks, Jeff. Can you explain the calculation of 30 to 40% an owner could expect to receive for cash rent? 30 to 40% of what?
Yeah, I apologize. I probably could have done a better job of that, but that's of the gross income per acre generated by the farm. So if you're raising corn and you raise 200 bushel corn at $5, that's $1,000. 30% would be roughly $300, for example. Same way on beans. If you're raising a bean crop and it's 60 bushels at $10, that's $600 of gross income. So you have to be careful when you're setting that you don't set yourself up to send a wrong message. If you're going to only calculate it based on the corn income, you can't be disappointed if all they want to raise is corn. If you want to see a crop rotation on your farm, you need to take that into consideration as you're setting your rent. And again, lay that expectation out for your operators because otherwise they may take advantage of whatever the market is telling them to do and not really take into consideration what your expectations are.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you have any information about the use of cover crops in southeastern Nebraska? Are more operators getting interested?
Now, I think in general across the Corn Belt, there's more interest in it. In the areas where there's a lot of heavy tillage, cover crops are not taking a hold quite as quickly. But in those areas where we're starting to see more people no-till and look for ways to conserve soil, I think that's where it's getting picked up first. Southeast Nebraska is in an area where we usually get a long enough growing season that even after harvest is complete, you have time for a cover crop to get going. Where we're seeing the most difficulty is as you go into the northern climates, maybe into South Dakota or southern Minnesota, where, if harvest doesn't occur until late November, there's really not much growing season left to get a rye or cover crop going, and then it's more difficult to justify.
Thanks, Jeff. It looks like we have time for a couple more questions. Is there a direct correlation between the percentage increase in input costs and the percentage increase in cash rent?
I can tell you that's definitely not the case, because we're not going to see rents double, and we've seen fertilizer prices double, for example. But certainly crop inputs are going to get their share of what they see out there as income potential, and so they're going to go up. But there's no direct correlation between that and what cash rents go up.
Looks like we have time for one more question. Does the lease type determine if estate taxes can be eliminated if not selling or giving to a relative?
Again, lease type offers you more flexibility in your estate planning process because there's programs that you can take advantage of that aren't available under a cash rent, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate the possibility of estate tax. If you have a big enough estate, you're going to pay some tax, but certainly, for example, the special use valuation, that allows you to reduce your estate by up to $1 million through the use of the special use valuation if you have enough acres. And so that's a pretty big deal if that's going to eliminate 40% tax on $1 million. So yeah, it's important. If you're under a cash rent lease, that option isn't even available to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you both, Cal and Jeff, for your willingness to help answer some of these questions during our Q&A session.